The private jet reached cruising altitude when every signal vanished, the cockpit door locked, and three strangers rose from their seats with weapons drawn inside the polished cabin. Every executive lowered their eyes, the pilots stayed silent, and Amelia was ordered to surrender her company's control codes before the plane banked toward an abandoned runway. Nobody paid attention to Mason, the quiet, single father sitting near the back in a worn jacket, his eyes calm and unreadable. They assumed he was nothing more than a temporary repairman hired at the last minute. That one careless mistake would end up saving everyone aboard the aircraft. The private airfield outside Seattle sat under a gray morning sky, rain drifting sideways in thin sheets, wind pulling at the windsocks near the hangars. Runway lights blinked pale gold against the wet concrete, and the smell of jet fuel mixed with cold rain in the air. It was the kind of morning that made everything look sharper somehow, the metal of parked aircraft gleaming under low clouds, the world quiet except for the occasional roar of an engine warming up in the distance. Amelia stood near the base of the stairs leading up to her company's private jet, a tablet in one hand, her coat collar turned up against the wind. She was the chief executive of a technology company that built emergency rescue systems for commercial aircraft and private medical jets, and this flight to Denver carried more weight than most. She was going to sign the largest contract of her career, a deal worth billions tied to a new generation of airborne emergency rescue technology, the kind of system that could one day save thousands of lives without anyone ever knowing it existed. Around her moved the small circle of people she trusted, or believed she trusted. Charlotte, her chief financial officer, walked briskly beside her, clutching a leather folder against her chest like it held something fragile. Ryan, the head of internal security, stood near the stairs barking quiet instructions to the ground crew, his eyes scanning the tarmac with the practiced tension of a man who took his job seriously, or wanted everyone to think he did. Samuel, the captain, and Hunter, his first officer, were already inside completing pre-flight checks, while Evelyn, the lead flight attendant, greeted each passenger by name as they boarded, her warmth calm and practiced. Near the back of the boarding line stood a man nobody paid much attention to. He wore a jacket that had seen better winters, carried a small tool bag slung over one shoulder, and said almost nothing as he walked. His name was Mason, and he had been called in that morning as outside technical support, one of several contractors brought on for last-minute maintenance checks before a high-profile flight. Nobody asked him much about himself, and he offered nothing unprompted. He simply worked. Mason was a single father. His daughter, Mia, existed for him mostly in missed calls and unanswered texts these days, in the quiet promises he made to himself about being better, about making it home for dinner more often than he managed. He carried a photograph of her folded into his wallet, though he rarely looked at it in front of others. That morning, before the sun had fully risen, he had already checked in twice with her school, just to hear that she had made it there safely. Years earlier, Mason had been something else entirely. He had worked as a specialist in aviation safety systems, part of a small team responsible for designing emergency protocols meant to protect commercial aircraft from exactly the kind of disaster nobody wanted to imagine. But a professional incident had ended that chapter of his life abruptly, one that left his name quietly erased from an industry that once relied on his judgment. He had not spoken of it since. He simply left and started over, fixing what needed fixing, asking for nothing more than a fair wage and a quiet life. Before boarding, Mason had noticed something small wrong with the backup communication system tucked behind a panel near the rear galley, a minor fault that most technicians would have missed entirely. He fixed it without mentioning it to anyone the way he fixed most things, without ceremony, without needing credit. Amelia barely registered him as she climbed the stairs. Ryan had mentioned only briefly that a contractor had been brought in last minute to handle a technical issue before departure, nothing more. When Mason lingered near an auxiliary panel a few minutes longer than necessary, checking wiring that had nothing to do with his assigned task, Ryan's expression tightened, his voice edged with an irritation that seemed sharper than the situation warranted, as though he were afraid of what Mason might notice if given enough time to look. Nobody could have known, watching that gray morning unfold, that Mason had been quietly underestimated by nearly everyone standing on that tarmac, that Amelia was surrounded by people who did not entirely deserve her trust, and that the flight about to depart for Denver was not simply a business trip. It was the beginning of something none of them had prepared for. The jet lifted off through the gray weather, climbing steadily despite the turbulence that rattled the windows during the first few minutes of ascent. Samuel and Hunter kept the aircraft steady with practiced calm, the kind of quiet competence that came from years of flying through worse. Inside, the cabin transformed the noise of the storm into something almost forgettable, its leather seats and dimmed lighting creating a bubble of comfort that made the world outside feel distant and unimportant. The interior looked more like a private lounge than an aircraft cabin. A polished conference table sat near the center, flanked by a presentation screen currently displaying the opening slide of Amelia's pitch, a schematic diagram of the new rescue system her team had spent 3 years developing. Soft light spilled from recessed fixtures overhead, and the hum of the engines faded into the background as she began organizing her thoughts. Amelia's presentation focused on a breakthrough piece of technology, an automated system capable of detecting catastrophic failure and transmitting emergency signals without requiring human intervention, a system that could shave critical minutes off rescue response times during the worst kind of disaster. It was the culmination of her company's work, and everything about today's meeting in Denver depended on convincing the board across the table that it was ready for deployment. Charlotte fidgeted with the strap of her bag, worried aloud about the sensitive data stored on Amelia's biometric security device, data that included proprietary details about the rescue system's architecture. Ryan, seated near the front, assured everyone that security had been checked 3 times over, that nobody could possibly breach a flight of this caliber. His voice carried the practiced confidence of a man used to being believed without question. Near the back of the cabin, apart from the polished table and the murmur of business conversation, Mason sat quietly, uninvited into the discussion happening a few rows ahead. One of the board members, a heavyset man with an expensive watch, glanced toward Mason's worn jacket and murmured something to his neighbor about contractors who had no business being seated so close to the front of a private jet. Laughter followed, quiet but unmistakable. Amelia did not personally insult him, but she was too consumed by her preparations to notice the exchange, and her silence created its own kind of distance, a coldness that settled over Mason without her intending it. He said nothing in response. He simply continued watching, listening in a way most passengers never bothered to. He noticed things nobody else seemed to register. The faint hum of the ventilation system cycling slightly off rhythm, a soft static crackling occasionally through Evelyn's headset, a flicker in one of the auxiliary indicator lights near the rear bulkhead that blinked for less than a second before returning to normal. These were small things, the kind of details a person only noticed if they had spent years trained to notice exactly this sort of thing before it became a catastrophe. Evelyn, moving through the cabin with drink service, caught Mason's eyes more than once and sensed something different about him, something that did not match the quiet, unassuming posture he kept. He watched the cabin the way someone watches a room they expect trouble to enter, not with fear, but with quiet readiness. Ryan approached Mason directly at one point, his tone clipped, instructing him to remain seated and avoid touching any of the technical panels near the rear of the aircraft for the remainder of the flight. Mason nodded once, said nothing, and returned his attention to the window. But beneath that calm exterior, he had already noticed something in Ryan's posture, a tightness beneath the professional mask, a tension that did not belong to a man who believed everything was under control. As the aircraft leveled off at cruising altitude, the satellite signal feeding the cabin's communication display flickered for several seconds, a brief gap that most passengers never noticed at all. Mason looked up toward the ceiling of the cabin, his expression shifting from quiet observation into something sharper, something that had not been present a moment before. Mason kept his eyes on the small route display embedded in the cabin bulkhead, the one most passengers ignored entirely, and noticed the aircraft's heading had drifted by a small but deliberate margin from the flight path filed before departure. It was not the kind of shift caused by ordinary wind correction. It was too precise, too consistent to be an accident. Hunter's voice came over the cabin speaker a moment later, calm and professional, announcing minor weather interference ahead and asking everyone to remain seated with their belts fastened. But something in his tone rang false, a stiffness that did not match the ease he usually carried when addressing passengers. Samuel had gone quiet on the intercom entirely, no longer offering the small updates he typically gave during smooth stretches of flight, and Evelyn noticed it first, her expression tightening as she glanced toward the cockpit door. Amelia, still absorbed in her presentation notes, pressed forward with the meeting, asking Charlotte to confirm the final figures in their financial projections. She had no reason yet to suspect anything beyond ordinary turbulence. Ryan, seated near the middle of the cabin, received a message on his personal device, his eyes flicking down for only a second before he rose from his seat and moved toward the rear of the aircraft without explanation. Mason watched him go. From his position near the back, He saw Ryan unlock a storage compartment that should have required flight crew authorization, the kind of access panel meant only for emergency equipment and secured documentation. It was not the kind of thing a head of internal security opened without cause, and certainly not without informing the captain first. Moments later, a man Mason did not recognize emerged from the same rear section, dressed in the plain uniform of an auxiliary maintenance technician. Mason remembered the pre-flight briefing clearly. There had been no such technician listed among the maintenance crew cleared for boarding that morning. The man's presence made no sense, unless someone had arranged for him to be there without anyone else knowing. That man was Connor, though nobody in the cabin knew his name yet, the leader of a small group who had been placed aboard the aircraft through quiet cooperation from someone already inside the company's trusted circle. Mason noticed a compact device clipped to his belt, small enough to be missed by a casual glance, but recognizable to anyone who understood aviation communication systems. It was a signal jammer, powerful enough to interrupt secondary frequencies without triggering the kind of catastrophic failure that would bring the aircraft down immediately. Mason began to rise from his seat, intending to quietly alert Evelyn to what he had seen, but Ryan intercepted him first, stepping into the aisle with a coldness that had replaced his earlier irritation entirely. He told Mason, in a low voice meant only for the two of them, that he was nothing more than a hired contractor, and that causing a panic in front of Amelia would guarantee he never worked in this industry again. Mason said nothing in reply. He simply looked down at Ryan's hand gripping the seat back beside him and noticed a thin trace of technical grease along the edge of his fingers, the kind that came from handling equipment inside a maintenance compartment, not from anything a security director should have reason to touch that morning. The moment demanded restraint rather than confrontation. Mason understood he had enough to suspect something was deeply wrong, but nothing solid enough yet to convince anyone who did not already believe him, and right now nobody did. The cabin lights flickered once, then steadied. A soft mechanical click sounded somewhere near the front of the aircraft, and Evelyn, standing near the cockpit door, tried the access panel out of habit and found that the usual entry code no longer responded at all. Connor and his two accomplices stepped forward into the open cabin, no longer hiding behind uniforms or false explanations, weapons drawn openly for the first time. He announced, in a voice devoid of urgency, that the aircraft had already been rerouted and that all outside communication had been severed. The elegant hush of the cabin shattered instantly, replaced by the sharp intake of breath, the scrape of chairs, the low murmur of fear spreading from seat to seat. Charlotte clutched her data folder against her chest as though it might shield her from what was happening. Several board members lowered their heads instinctively, the way people do when danger enters a room and instinct overrides reason. Evelyn moved carefully among the passengers, her training holding steady even as her pulse clearly raced, trying to keep the cabin from tipping into full panic. Amelia rose from her seat and faced Connor directly, her voice cold and controlled despite everything happening around her. She attempted to negotiate, offering resources, offering anything that might de-escalate the situation. Connor was unmoved by talk of money. What he wanted was Amelia's biometric access, the key to transferring control of a rescue technology project worth more than most companies would earn in a decade. He revealed almost casually that someone inside her own company had sold the flight schedule, the aircraft layout, and details of the contract now sitting inside Charlotte's folder. Ryan, still positioned near the middle of the cabin, feigned shock at the revelation, but Mason caught the half-second delay in his reaction, the beat too slow to be genuine surprise. Connor forced Amelia to begin preparing a data transfer order directly aboard the aircraft, insisting it be completed before they landed on an abandoned runway he refused to name. Samuel remained silent from the cockpit, Hunter equally unresponsive, and the growing silence from the front of the plane created the unmistakable impression that control up there had already been compromised. Mason remained seated near the back, head lowered just enough to appear frightened like everyone else. In truth, he was counting the intervals between subtle shifts in cabin pressure, listening to the rhythm of the engines, tracking the barely perceptible tilt of the fuselage beneath him. Years of training had not left him, even after all this time away from it. He understood something the hijackers did not yet realize. The aircraft had not been fully compromised. There remained an older safety pathway built into the plane's original rescue architecture, one that predated most of the modern systems Connor's people had studied before planning this operation, a pathway Mason suspected Connor knew nothing about. He also understood the danger of moving too quickly. If he acted before he had a clear opening, Connor might panic and put the entire cabin at greater risk. Patience, more than courage, was what this moment required, and Mason had spent years learning the difference between the two. Around the cabin, small signs of resistance had already begun to surface, quiet and unspoken. Evelyn adjusted the position of a service cart near the galley, seemingly out of habit, though her eyes flicked briefly toward Mason as she did it. A retired executive near the window kept his hands visible on his lap, breathing slowly, deliberately, the way people do when they are trying not to give anyone a reason to notice them. Fear moved through the cabin in waves, but beneath it, something steadier was beginning to take shape, though none of the hijackers seemed to notice it yet. Connor moved toward Amelia, placing a small biometric scanning device on the table in front of her, his patience visibly thinning as the minutes stretched on. He studied her face for any sign of hesitation, the practiced stare of a man who had done this kind of thing before and expected obedience born from fear. Amelia held his gaze without flinching, though her fingers trembled faintly against the edge of the table out of view. Behind him, unnoticed in the chaos, Mason quietly worked a small metal ring free from his finger, the kind of subtle preparation that meant something was about to change. He slid it into his palm and closed his fist around it, his expression giving nothing away, his breathing steady, his eyes fixed calmly on the scene unfolding a few rows ahead. Connor forced Amelia to press her thumb against the first layer of the security scanner, watching closely as the device blinked to life. Amelia stalled, claiming the system required a secondary confirmation from a ground server before the next layer would unlock, a small delay tactic meant to buy precious time. Connor smiled thinly and explained that the ground server had already been fed a false signal hours earlier, proof that this operation had been planned with far more care than anyone aboard had imagined. Charlotte's stomach dropped as she realized only someone deeply familiar with the company's internal verification process could have known enough to fake it convincingly. Ryan's composure began to slip, the mask of a frightened victim falling away piece by piece. He stopped pretending shock and instead spoke with the sharp confidence of someone finally admitting the truth. He told Amelia she had ignored months of warnings that the board wanted her removed, and that this flight had become the fastest way to force her out of control entirely. Amelia stared at him, stunned in a way that went deeper than fear. This was the man she had trusted with the entire security apparatus of her company, the man she had personally promoted years earlier. Betrayal from a stranger was one thing. Betrayal from someone she had defended in boardrooms was another entirely. Connor ordered one of his men to search the rear of the cabin, where Mason sat trying to appear as unremarkable as possible. The accomplice rifled through Mason's tool bag and paused, noticing several pieces of specialized equipment that did not belong in an ordinary repairman's kit, tools built for diagnostic work far more advanced than routine maintenance. Ryan's eyes narrowed as he watched from across the cabin. He understood, faster than Connor did, that Mason might be a bigger risk than anyone had accounted for. He mentioned, almost offhandedly, that Mason had an old file buried somewhere in the industry's records, a specialist quietly pushed out of his career following an internal investigation years earlier. Mason answered calmly, without raising his voice, saying that Ryan had only ever read the version other people had written to protect themselves. The simple weight of that sentence caught Amelia's attention in a way nothing else had that day. For the first time since boarding, she actually looked at Mason, not as a contractor, not as background noise, but as someone with a story she had never bothered to ask about. Connor mocked him next, calling him a washed-up single father who spent his days fixing things for people richer than he would ever be. Mason did not answer the insult. Something in his eyes shifted instead, moving away from quiet endurance and toward calculation, the look of a man who had stopped absorbing and started planning. Across the cabin, Evelyn responded to a series of small, almost invisible signals from Mason, gestures so subtle most people would never have noticed them at all. She guided passengers gently away from the main aisle, dimmed one of the overhead cabin lights, and locked the service cart into position near a corner that would later matter more than anyone realized. Mason was quietly reshaping the cabin into a safer space without giving the hijackers any reason to suspect what he was doing. Connor noticed Evelyn's movements breaking from his earlier instructions and spun toward her, his voice rising sharply for the first time since the takeover began. In that instant of distraction, Mason rose to his feet, standing for the first time since the ordeal had started. Mason rose slowly, both hands open at his sides, his voice steady and deliberately calm, careful not to provoke Connor into a reaction he could not control. He told Connor plainly that he did not actually want this aircraft to go down because he needed Amelia alive and cooperative to unlock the data he was after. Connor's expression flickered with something close to respect, or perhaps unease, as he realized this quiet contractor had correctly read the shape of his entire plan. Mason continued, pointing out that the aircraft was descending too quickly for the direction they had been forced into, and that landing on an unprepared runway in this weather put Connor's own life at just as much risk as everyone else aboard. The observation rattled his accomplices more than Connor wanted to admit. Ryan, furious that Mason was undermining the fragile control they had built, demanded Connor deal with him immediately, but Connor held up a hand, curious now, wanting to understand how a hired repairman understood aircraft systems this deeply. Amelia asked quietly but directly who Mason really was. He answered simply that he had once worked with aviation rescue systems before leaving the industry behind. Ryan, still bitter, sneered that Mason had been forced to take responsibility for a safety failure years ago, a story he clearly intended as an insult. Mason offered only the barest outline in response. He had discovered a serious flaw in a safety system years earlier, one that could have cost lives, but the people above him buried the discovery and quietly shifted the blame onto him instead, protecting a lucrative contract rather than admitting the truth. After that, Mason chose silence. He raised his daughter alone, stayed away from recognition, and built a smaller, quieter life far from the industry that had discarded him. Something in Amelia's expression shifted as she listened, a dawning understanding of why Mason had accepted every slight since boarding without complaint. He had spent years learning to absorb exactly this kind of dismissal, expecting nothing better from people who never bothered to look closely enough. While he spoke, Mason studied Connor's jamming device without appearing to. He recognized its limitations immediately. It was sophisticated enough to block modern communication lines, but it could not reach an older emergency frequency buried deep inside a previous generation of rescue architecture, one that predated everything Connor had studied before this operation. Reaching that old pathway meant getting to an auxiliary panel near the rear of the cabin, and Connor was watching him too closely for that to happen easily. Evelyn, understanding the problem without needing to be told, deliberately allowed an elderly passenger to appear more distressed than she truly was, drawing Connor's attention away for just a few critical seconds. Mason moved without hesitation but without haste either, nothing about his motion drawing unnecessary attention. He reached the panel, opened it quietly, and activated a silent distress signal built into the aircraft's original safety design, a signal that carried no voice, only a specific emergency code meant for exactly this kind of situation. Far below, inside a regional air traffic control center, a controller sitting in front of a bank of monitors noticed an old, rarely used code blinking steadily on his screen. The aircraft was still in the air. It had been forced off course, but it was still transmitting, still alive, still fighting. He called his supervisor over without raising his voice, pointing at the flickering signal, and within minutes a quiet alert had been passed along lines that Connor's people had no way of monitoring, paths built decades earlier for exactly this kind of emergency, and never fully retired from the system. Somewhere on the ground, people who did not yet know Amelia's name were already beginning to move on her behalf. Connor noticed the silent signal had been triggered almost immediately, understanding at once that Mason posed a far greater threat than any other passenger aboard. He dragged Mason back toward the center of the cabin, demanding he shut the system down before it drew any more attention. Mason told him, without raising his voice, that the system could not be disabled from the cabin once the first code had already been sent. There was no undoing what had already happened. Ryan, watching his carefully built plan begin to unravel, lost the last of his composure, his fear finally outweighing whatever confidence had carried him this far. Amelia used the chaos to her advantage, quietly slipping the real data device into a hidden pocket along the seat frame beside her, while handing Connor a decoy in its place. Charlotte, still trembling but steadier now, followed Amelia's lead, pretending to open a transfer file on her tablet to stretch the moment out as long as possible. Connor received an update from someone outside the aircraft informing him that flight control had already picked up unusual activity around their location. Furious, he ordered a faster descent, and the cabin shuddered violently as the aircraft dropped through turbulent air far too quickly for comfort. In the cockpit, Samuel found himself partially locked out of a secondary control system, while Hunter fought to keep the aircraft stable despite the growing communication gaps. Mason understood that without regaining access to the cockpit, the plane risked exceeding safe operating limits long before it ever reached Denver. Drawing on knowledge of the aircraft's original design, he guided Evelyn toward reopening an old internal communication line that connected directly to Hunter, a line that had been part of the plane's earliest safety architecture and long forgotten by anyone who had not helped design it. Hunter heard a static-laced voice cut through the old frequency and immediately recognized a level of technical understanding that went far beyond anything a standard maintenance contractor should possess. Mason instructed him calmly to hold their altitude steady and ignore any false commands that might come from Connor's people, no matter how convincing they sounded. Connor, sensing the ground shifting beneath his plan, turned to psychological pressure instead, mentioning Mia by name in an attempt to shatter Mason's composure entirely. For a moment, Mason faltered, his jaw tightening, something raw flashing behind his eyes before he forced it back down. He did not break. Instead, he said, quietly but with unmistakable weight, that it was precisely because he was a father that he refused to let a plane full of people die because of someone else's greed. It was the emotional center of everything Mason had carried since boarding, a private motivation spoken aloud for the first time, though his daughter herself remained far away, untouched by any of it. Outside the windows, the storm thickened. Lightning flickered somewhere beyond the clouds, illuminating the cabin for brief, stark seconds. Connor, out of patience and running short on time, ordered his men to prepare for a forced landing, his voice carrying the sharp edge of a plan collapsing faster than he could control. Amelia watched the exchange between Mason and Connor from across the cabin, gripping the edge of her seat, understanding now that everything about her carefully built life, every title, every contract, every layer of protection she had assumed surrounded her, meant nothing in a moment like this. What mattered was the quiet man in the worn jacket who had been the only person aboard actually paying attention since the wheels left the ground. Charlotte kept her tablet angled toward Connor, her thumb hovering over the screen as though still working, buying seconds that felt like hours. Evelyn moved silently between rows, her hand steady even as her heart pounded, checking that every belt was fastened, every passenger braced as best they could be for whatever came next. Nobody spoke above a whisper now. The cabin had become a place where survival depended on discipline, not noise, and everyone aboard seemed to understand that instinctively, even those who had never faced anything like it before. Amelia understood, in the middle of that shuddering cabin, that every degree she held, every position she had earned, meant nothing if she placed her trust in the wrong person at the wrong moment. She looked at Mason now, not as hired help brought aboard to fix a minor technical fault, but as the last real chance any of them had of walking away from this flight alive. Mason needed her to do something dangerous. He asked her, in a low voice only she could hear, to pretend to complete the data transfer process convincingly enough that Connor would lower his guard for just a few critical minutes. It was a request built entirely on trust, the kind Amelia had rarely extended to anyone outside her closest circle. She stood at a crossroads. She could fight to protect her company by resisting outright, or she could protect the lives aboard by trusting a man she had known for less than a day. She chose Mason. Turning back to Connor with practiced calm, Amelia told him she was prepared to unlock the final security layer, but that the connection needed to stabilize first or the device risked wiping the very data he wanted. Connor's greed pulled him straight into the opening she had created, and he ordered Ryan to check the connection himself. Ryan bent toward the small device near the bulkhead, momentarily abandoning his position blocking the aisle. Mason caught Evelyn's eye and signaled for her to move the remaining passengers further back, tightening their belts, keeping their heads low, preparing them for whatever came next without alarming Connor's remaining men. Charlotte activated the decoy device, letting its screen show a fabricated progress bar crawling toward completion, convincing enough that Connor believed the real transfer was already underway. Mason used the opening to move toward the auxiliary cockpit door, careful, quiet, deliberate. He did not attempt to force his way through with raw strength. Instead, he used an old technical access sequence, one buried deep in the rescue system's original architecture, a method long forgotten by anyone who had not helped design it decades earlier. Inside the cockpit, Hunter recognized the signal and opened a small verification link in response. Connor realized what was happening a moment too late and lunged toward Mason, trying to stop him before the sequence completed. Mason responded with quick, efficient movement, nothing dramatic or drawn out, using the narrow cabin space and a length of seatbelt webbing to subdue one of Connor's remaining men without wasted motion. Ryan attempted to flee toward the rear of the cabin, hoping to disappear into the chaos, but Charlotte blocked his path with the service cart Evelyn had positioned earlier, sending him stumbling against a row of empty seats. Amelia stood in the center aisle, steady for the first time not because of her title, but because she was actively protecting the people around her. Mason finally reached the cockpit door and pushed through, Finding Samuel injured but conscious, Hunter exhausted but still holding the aircraft together, warning lights blinking steadily across the instrument panel, they're filling the small space with a constant, urgent rhythm that had not stopped in several minutes. Behind him, the cabin was far from settled. One of Connor's remaining men shouted for order, but his voice had lost its earlier authority, cracking under the pressure of a plan that had clearly slipped beyond his control. Passengers who had spent the last hour frozen in fear began, almost without realizing it, to draw strength from watching Amelia stand firm in the aisle, her posture no longer that of a woman negotiating for her life, but of someone actively defending the people she was responsible for. Evelyn moved quickly to secure the last of the loose items in the galley, bracing herself against a bulkhead as the aircraft shuddered through another pocket of turbulence. Somewhere beneath the noise and the fear, a fragile kind of order had begun to take hold, built not from authority or rank, but from the quiet decisions a handful of people had made to trust each other when it mattered most. Inside the cockpit, chaos pressed in from every direction. Warning indicators lit the panel in overlapping bursts, the autopilot system compromised by outside interference, primary communication still only partially restored. Mason took in the scene quickly, his mind sorting through the layers of failure with the same steady focus that had carried him through the entire ordeal so far. He did not try to take over as pilot. Instead, he supported Hunter with deep technical knowledge, keeping the roles clear between them. Hunter remained the one flying the aircraft, while Mason worked to unlock and stabilize the safety layers that had been deliberately corrupted. Samuel, though weakened, stayed conscious enough to confirm that Mason's instincts were correct, offering brief nods of confirmation whenever his strength allowed. Down in the cabin, Connor had not yet been fully subdued, his voice rising in sharp bursts as he continued pressing Amelia for compliance. Ryan, cornered and desperate, understood that if the aircraft landed safely, every piece of his betrayal would surface before the day ended. Mason managed to restore a partial link to ground control. Air traffic instructions came through, redirecting them toward a safer runway near Denver, though the weather remained hostile and the fuel reserves had been badly strained by the earlier forced course change. Hunter admitted quietly that he was not certain the aircraft could handle a landing while so many of its systems remained unstable. Then Mason discovered something else. Connor had planted a false lock inside one of the auxiliary control circuits, feeding the aircraft corrupted altitude information designed to confuse the crew during descent. Mason recognized the method almost instantly, a cold realization settling over him as the pieces connected. He had designed the original fail-safe protections for this exact generation of aircraft system years earlier, before everything had been taken from him. It was a strange, bitter twist. The rescue technology Amelia's company was preparing to sell to the world had grown in part from ideas that had once been stripped away from Mason without credit or acknowledgement. Amelia, listening through the partially restored internal line, absorbed the revelation in silence. Her company may have benefited for years from an injustice she had never known existed, built unknowingly on the foundation of someone else's stolen work. Mason did not use the moment to accuse or demand anything. He simply said that the reckoning could come later, that right now, the only thing that mattered was bringing the aircraft down safely. The plane pushed through a wall of dark cloud, shuddering violently as rain hammered the windshield, passengers gripping armrests and murmuring quiet prayers throughout the cabin. Amelia moved among them, her voice low and steady, offering what calm she could while the storm raged outside. Together, Mason, Hunter, and Samuel worked in tight coordination, guiding the aircraft back onto its final approach. Through the storm, the lights of the runway finally appeared, faint gold beacons cutting through sheets of rain. But Connor, refusing to accept defeat, surged upward one final time, determined not to let the flight end on anyone's terms but his own. The cabin tensed at the sound of his voice rising again, sharp and desperate now, stripped of the calculated control he had carried since boarding. Ryan, sensing his own unraveling future, backed toward a corner of the galley, his hands trembling as he realized there was nowhere left to run once the wheels touched ground. Charlotte held her position near the aisle, the decoy device still glowing faintly in her palm, her eyes fixed on Amelia rather than on the chaos surrounding them, waiting for a signal, a word, anything that would tell her what to do next. In the cockpit, Mason kept his focus locked on the instruments, refusing to let the noise below distract him from the narrow window of stability they had fought so hard to create. Every second now mattered more than the last, and he intended to see this through to the ground. Connor lunged toward the cockpit, hoping to sabotage the final approach and force Amelia into one last act of surrender before the wheels touched ground. Amelia met him not with force but with composure, holding out the decoy device and telling him calmly that the transfer had already completed. For a few brief seconds, Connor believed he had won, until the device locked itself and displayed a false confirmation status designed exactly for this moment. Mason's voice came through the cabin speaker from the cockpit, informing everyone that Connor now held physical proof of his own confession in his hands. Charlotte had quietly recorded the entire exchange from the moment Connor first revealed his demands, and Ryan had been caught on the same recording admitting his role in the betrayal outright. Hunter guided the aircraft lower, Samuel managing final systems checks despite his injury, Mason holding the backup safety architecture steady through the last critical minutes of descent. The aircraft came down hard, brakes screaming against the wet runway, the fuselage shaking violently as it fought to slow against the force of its own speed. Passengers held their breath, gripping whatever they could reach, until the plane finally rolled to a stop near the end of the runway, emergency vehicles already converging from every direction, red and blue lights cutting through the rain. The cabin door opened, and cold, wet air rushed inside, carrying with it the sound of sirens and shouted instructions from the ground crew below. Connor and his remaining men were taken into custody within minutes, their plan finally and completely unraveled. Ryan tried to claim he had been coerced into everything from the very beginning, but Amelia no longer had any patience left for his excuses. She handed over every piece of evidence to the investigators who boarded shortly after, including the recording that confirmed Ryan had sold the flight schedule and internal security details that made the entire operation possible. Passengers stepped down from the aircraft in a daze, many of them turning back toward Mason with expressions entirely different from the ones they had worn during boarding that morning. The same board member who had mocked his jacket hours earlier now avoided his eyes completely, saying nothing at all. Evelyn was the first to reach him, her voice thick with emotion as she thanked him, telling him plainly that without his composure, the entire cabin would have descended into panic long before help ever arrived. Amelia stood a short distance away, wanting to say something, an apology forming somewhere behind her eyes, though she had not yet found the right words to begin. Mason stood beneath the rain near the base of the aircraft stairs, exhausted, quiet, his expression carrying none of the pride or relief someone might expect after surviving something like this. He looked, more than anything, like a man who had simply done what needed doing, nothing more, nothing less. Investigators moved briskly across the tarmac, gathering statements from shaken passengers while medics checked Samuel's injuries and confirmed he would recover fully. Charlotte sat wrapped in a blanket near one of the emergency vehicles, still clutching the recording device that had ended up mattering more than any contract she had carried onto that flight. Somewhere nearby, Hunter leaned against the fuselage, staring up at the rain-streaked sky, quietly grateful the aircraft he had fought so hard to hold steady had finally come to rest. For a long moment, nobody spoke, the silence filled only by the sound of rain against metal and the distant wail of sirens finally beginning to fade. Amelia watched Mason from a few steps away, understanding perhaps for the first time all day exactly how much had been asked of him and how little he had ever asked for in return. In the days following the hijacking, the investigation widened far beyond anything anyone initially expected. Ryan had not only betrayed Amelia for that single flight. He had spent months quietly concealing deeper failures within the company's entire internal security structure, failures that could have caused harm long before this incident ever occurred. Mason's old file was reopened at the request of federal investigators eager to understand how someone with his background had ended up working as a contractor on a hijacked private jet. The truth came out clearly this time, verified and documented. Mason had never caused the safety failure that ended his career years earlier. He had warned his superiors about a serious flaw in the system, and they had chosen to protect a valuable contract by quietly placing the blame on him instead. Amelia discovered something else during the same investigation, something that struck her harder than she expected. Part of her company's current rescue technology had been built, years earlier, on a design originally created by the same team Mason had once belonged to, a design taken without proper credit after his departure. She felt a deep discomfort realizing her company's reputation rested, at least in part, on a foundation shaped by an injustice she had known nothing about. A few days later, Amelia went to see Mason at a quiet hangar on the outskirts of the city. She did not bring a team of lawyers or a prepared statement, only Charlotte and a modest folder of documents. She wanted this conversation to be honest, not staged. She apologized to him directly without excuses, for failing to see his value from the beginning, for staying silent while others dismissed him that morning on the tarmac, and for the fact that her company had unknowingly benefited from wrongs done to him years before they had ever met. Mason did not offer easy forgiveness in return. He told her plainly that what he needed was not praise or public recognition, but the simple correction of a record that had been wrong for far too long. Amelia agreed without hesitation. She moved quickly to restore his professional reputation publicly, offering him an independent safety advisory role on the very project he had unknowingly helped shape years earlier. She also established a training fund for overlooked aviation technicians, naming it after the very RIC program Mason had once proposed before everything had been taken from him. Later that evening, Mason received a short voice message from Mia, a quiet reminder not to forget dinner that night, nothing more than that, a small, ordinary detail carried gently at the very end of an extraordinary day. He allowed himself a brief, genuine smile, not because of the recognition finally offered to him, but simply because he was alive to hear her voice at all. Amelia watched him walk away from the hangar beneath a sky that had finally cleared after days of rain, understanding fully now that the person who had saved that aircraft was never the loud hero people expected. He was a quiet father, shaped by years of quiet unfairness, who had chosen without hesitation to save people who had barely noticed him at all. The jet stood repaired behind them, sunlight breaking through scattered clouds, casting long light across the wet tarmac, closing the story with a sense of justice finally restored and a quiet kind of healing that no headline could ever fully capture. Stay until the end to see one quiet father turn a sky full of terror into something like a miracle.